Silver Creek, Wyoming Territory, 1882. The frontier spread before Nolan McAllister like an untamed beast, wild, beautiful, and ultimately indifferent to human suffering. At 26, he'd already buried more friends than most men twice his age, and had the scars to prove that trusting too deeply out here was a fool's gambit. The harsh lessons of the frontier had taught him one immutable truth. Attachment was a luxury he couldn't afford, not when death rode alongside every cattle drive and lurked behind every saloon door. A man survives out here by keeping his own counsel and his gun oiled. He often told the younger hands at the Rockingham Ranch where he served as foreman. His handsome features, usually set in stern concentration beneath his sandy brown hair, rarely betrayed the loneliness that sometimes visited him during the long prairie nights. The young cowhand's reputation had been hard-won. His quick reflexes and steady aim had earned respect. His fairness and work ethic had earned loyalty. But the wall he'd built around his heart remained impenetrable. The other cowboys knew better than to mention the empty cabin he returned to each night, or how he declined invitations to socials and dances with the same practiced excuse. The frontier's no place for foolish notions of romance. I've got cattle to mind. What Nolan believed he wanted was simple: to someday save enough to buy his own modest spread, to build something with his own two hands that belonged solely to him. What he couldn't admit, even to himself, was the hollow feeling that crept in during thunderstorms when the bunkhouse filled with stories of sweethearts and wives waiting in town. Victoria Blackwell stepped off the stagecoach onto Silver Creek's dusty Main Street, clutching her worn carpet bag with white-knuckled determination. At 22, she was neither fashionable nor striking in the way that turned heads. Her simple brown dress had seen better days, and her chestnut hair was pulled back in a practical bun beneath a modest bonnet. The long journey from Boston had left dark circles beneath her intelligent hazel eyes. Plain as a fence post, one cowboy muttered to another as she passed. "Poor things come to teach school, I hear." Victoria pretended not to hear, but her shoulders straightened imperceptibly. She had come west not merely to teach, but to escape the suffocating pity that had followed her since her fiancé had abandoned her at the altar for her more vivacious cousin. "You're too bookish, Victoria," he had explained with cruel honesty. "A man wants a wife who brightens a room, not one who disappears into the wallpaper." Those words had crystallized her belief that she was destined for spinsterhood, that she was too plain, too serious, too much a creature of intellect rather than grace to inspire genuine affection. The frontier offered what Boston could not: purpose without constant reminders of her inadequacy. The schoolhouse awaited, as did 27 children who needed education more than they needed social graces. This would be enough, she told herself. It had to be. 3 weeks after Victoria's arrival, a sudden downpour trapped Nolan in town. The supply run had taken longer than expected, and now sheets of rain transformed the dusty streets into rivers of mud. Taking shelter beneath the general store's awning, he watched in dismay as the skies showed no sign of clearing. "Mr. McAllister?" A soft voice startled him from his brooding contemplation of the storm. He turned to find the new schoolteacher struggling with a stack of books and papers threatening to collapse in the wind. Without thinking, he reached out to steady her burden. "Miss Blackwell," he acknowledged with a polite nod. They'd been briefly introduced at church the previous Sunday, though he'd barely glanced at her then. Now, standing closer, he noticed the intelligence in her eyes and the determined set of her jaw. "I don't suppose the weather forecast mentioned this deluge," she said with unexpected dry humor. "Weather forecasts out here are about as reliable as politicians' promises," he replied, surprised to find himself smiling slightly. A sudden gust sent her papers flying. Together they scrambled to recover them before they were lost to the mud. By the time they gathered the last one, they were both laughing, a sound so unfamiliar to Nolan that it caught him off guard. "You're headed to the boarding house?" he asked, surprising himself with the concern in his voice. She nodded, glancing doubtfully at the flooded street. "I'll see you there safely," he offered, before his usual caution could intervene. What began as simple courtesy became something more as they splashed through puddles, his steady hand at her elbow. Their conversation flowed naturally from the weather to books. She was astonished to discover he'd read Thoreau and Emerson during long winter nights, to the challenges of frontier education. "These children deserve more than just reading and figures," she said passionately. They need to see beyond these mountains, to imagine possibilities. Most folks come west to escape book learning, he observed. Is that why you came? She asked quietly. The directness of her question pierced the armor he wore so comfortably. No, ma'am. I came because the land doesn't lie to you. It's harsh but honest. Unlike people, she ventured. Their eyes met, and in that moment, something shifted between them, a recognition that perhaps they were both hiding from similar wounds. When they reached the boarding house porch, he surprised himself again by asking, "Will you be attending the Founders' Day social next month, Miss Blackwell?" "I'm afraid I won't know many people," she demurred. "You'd know me," he said simply, then tipped his hat and stepped back into the rain before she could respond. That night, in his solitary cabin, Nolan couldn't explain why the schoolteacher's voice kept replaying in his mind, or why, for the first time in years, the silence around him felt heavier than usual. As summer progressed into early autumn, Nolan found himself making increasingly frequent trips to town. Sometimes he'd pause near the schoolhouse, listening to Victoria's clear voice guiding her students through recitations. Occasionally, their paths would cross at the general store or after Sunday services, and each encounter left him more unsettled than the last. "You've been to town more in the past month than the entire year before," observed Ben Tucker, one of the older hands, as they mended fences together. "Ranch business," Nolan replied curtly. "Must be mighty important business that always seems to happen when school lets out," the older man chuckled. Nolan drove a fence post with unnecessary force. "The schoolteacher is an educated lady from the East. She deserves proper respect, not cowboy gossip." "Didn't say nothing about disrespect," Ben said mildly. "Just noting that you've taken quite an interest in making her feel welcome." Nolan had no ready response because he couldn't explain his own behavior. Victoria Blackwell represented everything he'd told himself to avoid: connection, vulnerability, the risk of caring for someone in a land that took as easily as it gave. Yet something in her quiet strength called to him. For Victoria, Silver Creek was slowly becoming home. Her students responded to her gentle but firm guidance, and several mothers had sought her advice on continuing their children's education. Yet social invitations remained scarce, and she often overheard whispers about her plain appearance and serious demeanor. "Such a shame about Miss Blackwell," Mrs. Henderson confided loudly to another woman at the mercantile, while Victoria pretended to examine fabric bolts. "Smart as a whip, but no man wants a wife who outthinks him. And that drab way of dressing. She'll be teaching until her hair turns gray, mark my words." The words stung with familiar pain, confirming Victoria's deepest fears. Yet that evening, as she graded arithmetic papers by lamplight, a knock at her boarding house door revealed Nolan McAllister holding a parcel. "Brought you something from the ranch," he said simply, handing her a carefully wrapped bundle of books. "Found these in a trunk the boss's wife left behind. Thought your students might enjoy them." The thoughtfulness of the gesture left her momentarily speechless. As she unwrapped several well-preserved volumes of poetry and natural history, their fingers brushed, sending an unexpected warmth through her hand. "This is extraordinarily kind, Mr. McAllister." "Nolan," he corrected quietly. "And it's nothing, really." "It's not nothing to me," she replied with such genuine gratitude that he found himself lingering on her porch longer than propriety strictly allowed, discussing which poems might best capture the children's imagination. When Mrs. Parkington, the boarding house proprietress, cleared her throat pointedly from within, Nolan reluctantly bid Victoria good night. As he rode back to the ranch beneath the vast starlit sky, he realized with growing alarm that for the first time in years, his solitary existence no longer felt like safety. It felt like emptiness. The annual Founders' Day celebration arrived with all the excitement a frontier town could muster. Silver Creek's main street transformed with bunting and lanterns, and the newly constructed town hall would host its first grand ball. For days, the women of Silver Creek had discussed nothing else: who would wear what, which unmarried daughters might catch the eye of eligible ranchers. Victoria had resigned herself to attending only the daytime festivities with her students, having no suitable gown for the evening ball. The familiar pain of exclusion was a dull ache she'd almost grown accustomed to, until a package arrived at the schoolhouse, delivered by Mrs. Parkington with a mysterious smile. "This came for you, dear. No cinder marked, but I have my suspicions." Inside, Victoria found a dress of deep emerald silk that shimmered in the afternoon light. The cut was modest but fashionable, with delicate lace at the collar and cuffs. A small note read simply, "Your presence would brighten the ball considerably." N.M. Her hands trembled as she touched the beautiful fabric. No one had ever gifted her something so fine, so clearly chosen with care. The gesture touched something vulnerable within her, hope she'd thought long extinguished. That same afternoon, 30 miles away, Nolan received alarming news. A telegram from the sheriff warned that Jeremiah Sloan, a cattle rustler Nolan had testified against 3 years prior, had escaped custody and been spotted heading towards Silver Creek. Sloan had sworn vengeance against the yellow coward who'd put him behind bars. "You can't go to town tonight," the ranch owner insisted. "Sloan's dangerous. Let the sheriff handle this." But Nolan thought of Victoria in the dress he'd secretly ordered from Denver, of her walking home alone after the ball, unaware of the danger. "Post extra men at the ranch," he said, checking his revolver. "I've got business in town." The ball was already underway when Victoria entered the town hall. Conversations faltered as heads turned toward the doorway. She had pinned her chestnut hair in an elegant arrangement, with soft tendrils framing her face. The emerald dress complemented her hazel eyes and fair complexion, transforming her usual practical appearance. "Is that the schoolteacher?" whispered one young cowhand to another. "Can't be," his friend replied. "That lady's beautiful." Victoria felt the weight of every stare, her confidence wavering until a warm hand gently touched her elbow. "I was beginning to think you wouldn't come," Nolan said softly. She turned to find him more handsome than ever in a dark suit, his usually windswept hair neatly combed, his face freshly shaved. Something in his eyes when he looked at her made her breath catch. "The dress is too much," she whispered. "I feel conspicuous." "You look exactly as you should," he replied, "like a woman who belongs anywhere she chooses to be." When he led her onto the dance floor, the whispers followed, but for once, they were admiring rather than pitying. Victoria had never considered herself graceful, but in Nolan's confident lead, she moved with unexpected ease. "Where did you learn to dance like this?" she asked as he guided her through a waltz. "My mother insisted," he admitted. "Said a man should know how to be a gentleman, even if he chooses to be a cowboy." She was right. Victoria smiled up at him, suddenly aware of how perfectly their movements aligned, how natural it felt to be in his arms. As they danced, something shifted between them. The cautious friendship that had been building all summer deepened with each turn around the floor. When the music paused and he led her to the punch bowl, her hand remained tucked in his arm, and neither seemed inclined to create distance. "People are watching us," she observed. "Let them," he said simply. "I'm only concerned with one person's opinion tonight." The intensity of his gaze made her heart race. Before she could respond, the town's mayor approached, requesting her presence for the announcement of the school expansion fundraising results. Reluctantly, Nolan released her arm. "Save another dance for me," he whispered. As Victoria moved to join the mayor at the front of the hall, Nolan circulated through the crowd, eyes scanning for any sign of Sloan. The sheriff had promised extra deputies, but in a crowded room filled with strangers from neighboring towns, danger could hide in plain sight. Victoria's clear voice carried through the hall as she thanked the townspeople for their generosity toward the school. The sincere passion in her words captivated the audience, and Nolan felt an unfamiliar pride watching her. How had he never noticed how her entire face transformed when she spoke about her students? How her quiet determination could command a room? Just as she concluded her remarks to enthusiastic applause, Nolan spotted a familiar face at the back entrance. Jeremiah Sloan, thinner after prison but unmistakable with his scarred cheek, slipped into the hall. Time seemed to slow. Nolan calculated the distance to Victoria, searching for the quickest path through the crowd. Sloan's hand moved toward his coat, and Nolan lunged forward, pushing through dancing couples with desperate urgency. "Victoria!" he shouted, abandoning all propriety as he reached the podium just as Sloan drew his weapon. In one fluid motion, Nolan pulled Victoria behind him while drawing his own revolver. The crowd scattered in panic as two shots rang out almost simultaneously. Nolan felt the burn of a bullet grazing his upper arm, but his own shot found its mark. Sloan crumpled to the floor, his pistol clattering away across the polished boards. The next moments passed in chaos. deputies securing Sloan, who had survived the shoulder wound, women fanning themselves in distress, men clapping Nolan on the back for his quick action. But all he could focus on was Victoria's pale face as she pressed a handkerchief to his bleeding arm. "You could have been killed," she whispered, her voice shaking. "Better me than you," he replied simply. Her eyes searched his face. "Why would you risk your life for me?" The question hung between them, demanding truth he'd been avoiding for months. Before he could answer, the sheriff approached to take his statement, and Dr. Thompson insisted on examining his wound. An hour later, arm bandaged and statements given, Nolan found Victoria waiting on the town hall's porch, her emerald dress ghostly in the moonlight. The celebration continued subdued within, but she had slipped away from the commotion. "You never answered my question," she said as he approached. Nolan looked out over the sleeping town, gathering courage he'd never needed against any outlaw. "I've spent years believing that caring for someone out here is just asking for heartbreak, that a man survives by keeping to himself." He turned to face her fully. "But then you arrived in that dusty stagecoach with your books and your quiet dignity, and suddenly surviving didn't seem enough anymore." Victoria's eyes widened. "Nolan, let me finish," he said gently. "Tonight I realized something. When I saw Sloan aiming at you, I wasn't thinking about my safety or even justice. All I could think was that a world without you in it wasn't one I wanted to live in." Tears shimmered in her eyes. "The dress, the books, why me? I'm not like the other women in town. I've never been the one men notice." "Because you're the only woman I've ever met who makes me want to be better than I am," he said simply. "Because your eyes light up when you talk about poetry and your students. Because you see beauty in this harsh country that sometimes even I forget is there." He took a step closer. "And because somehow, when I'm with you, the ghosts that haunt me seem less powerful." Victoria trembled slightly as she reached up to touch his cheek. "I came west believing I was destined to be alone, that I was too plain, too serious to inspire genuine affection." "You were never plain," he whispered, "just waiting for someone who could truly see you." When his lips finally met hers, the last walls between them crumbled. The kiss was gentle at first, then deepened with the intensity of emotions too long denied. When they finally parted, breathless, the music from inside seemed to follow them into the night air. "They're playing another waltz," he observed, still holding her close. "Are you asking me to dance, Mr. McAllister?" "I'm asking for much more than a dance, Miss Blackwell," he replied seriously. "I'm asking if you might consider a future with a man who's only just learning how to open his heart." She smiled up at him, radiant in the moonlight. "I believe, sir, that would be the most worthwhile lesson either of us could undertake." 3 months later, as winter settled over the Wyoming territory, the small church in Silver Creek overflowed with well-wishers. Victoria stood before the altar in a gown of ivory satin, her chestnut hair adorned with tiny white flowers. Beside her, Nolan looked years younger than the solemn foreman who had once sworn off attachments, his eyes never leaving his bride's face as they spoke their vows. The modest cabin Nolan had once found so empty had been transformed. Bookshelves lined one wall, filled with volumes they would read together during the long winter evenings. A second bedroom was being prepared for the school term's end, when Victoria would bring her teaching skills home to their ranch, Nolan having purchased a small but promising spread with his savings and a loan from his grateful former employer. That evening, as they danced at their wedding celebration in the very hall where they had first waltzed, whispers followed them still, but they were whispers of admiration and perhaps a touch of envy. Who would have thought quiet Miss Blackwell would capture the most eligible foreman in the county? One woman remarked. "Look at them," replied another. "Have you ever seen two people more perfectly matched?" Nolan heard none of it, focused entirely on his wife's radiant face. "Happy, Mrs. McAllister?" he asked softly. "Happier than I ever believed possible," Victoria answered, her eyes reflecting the love that had transformed them both. As the music continued around them, they moved in perfect harmony, two souls who had found in each other not just passion or companionship, but something far more precious on the frontier, a home that would weather whatever storms came their way, built on foundations stronger than any cabin walls. "I used to believe the frontier was no place for love," Nolan murmured against her hair. Victoria smiled up at him. "And now I know it's the only thing that makes it worthwhile." The following spring, Travelers passing by the McAllister Ranch would often pause to observe the unusual sight. A handsome young rancher working alongside his beautiful wife, their laughter carrying across the windswept plains as they built their future together, proving that even in the harshest landscapes, love could not only survive, it could flourish.